My stepmother, Vivian, thought she was clever, standing in the doorway of what was supposed to be my childhood home, waving that crisp new will with a satisfied smirk. She'd waited exactly 3 days after Dad's funeral to deliver the news that everything he'd promised me, the house, the business, the legacy I'd served my country to protect, now belonged to her precious son, Marcus. What Vivian didn't know was that 12 years in Army Special Operations had taught me things about strategy, patience, and dismantling enemies that her suburban scheming couldn't even begin to comprehend. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The April rain hammered against the windows of 1247 Pine Ridge Avenue as I stood in the living room where I'd grown up, still wearing my dress blues from Dad's military funeral honors. The house felt different now, emptier somehow, even though nothing had physically changed. The same oak furniture Dad had built by hand still filled the space. The same family photos lined the mantelpiece, and the same American flag he'd flown every day since I enlisted still hung by the front door. But everything had changed. "I know this must come as a shock, Alex," Vivian said, her voice dripping with false sympathy as she smoothed her perfectly styled auburn hair. At 52, my stepmother had maintained the appearance that had initially caught Dad's attention 6 years ago, polished, put together, and calculating in a way that I'd recognized immediately, but Dad had been too lonely to see. Robert made his final wishes very clear in this new will. She held up the document like a trophy, its pages pristine white against her manicured red nails. The lawyer's letterhead gleamed official and final in the dim afternoon light. "That's impossible," I said, my voice steady despite the rage building in my chest. 12 years of military discipline had taught me to control my reactions, to process information before responding. Dad and I went over everything before my last deployment. The house was mine. Carter Construction was mine. That was the plan. Vivian's laugh was sharp and brittle. "Plans change, dear, especially when someone actually shows up to take care of an aging parent instead of abandoning them for months at a time." The accusation hit like a physical blow. I'd spent the last 18 months deployed in Afghanistan, leading a team through some of the most dangerous territory in the region. Every day I'd wondered if I'd make it home to keep the promises Dad and I had made to each other. The letters I'd written him from forward operating bases, the video calls when satellite connection allowed, the countdown calendar I'd kept marking days until I could come home and help him run the construction business he'd built from nothing. "I was serving my country," I replied, hearing the edge creep into my voice despite my training. Dad understood that. He was proud of my service. "Proud? Maybe." Vivian shrugged, examining her nails with deliberate indifference. "But pride doesn't keep an old man company during chemotherapy. Pride doesn't drive him to doctor's appointments or sit beside his hospital bed when he's scared and alone." The words hit harder because they contained a grain of truth that I'd been fighting since I got the call about Dad's cancer diagnosis 3 months ago. I'd requested emergency leave, but my commanding officer had denied it. We were in the middle of a critical operation that couldn't be compromised. Dad had insisted he understood, had told me to finish my mission and come home when I could. "Marcus stepped up," Vivian continued, as if reading my thoughts. "My son treated Robert like his own father, spent every evening here, helped with the business when Robert got too weak to manage things himself. That kind of loyalty deserves recognition." Marcus, my 28-year-old stepbrother who'd never worked a day of construction in his life, who drifted between retail jobs and community college courses since graduating high school a decade ago. The same Marcus who'd barely acknowledged Dad's existence unless he needed money, who'd rolled his eyes at Danner dinners whenever Dad talked about the military or hard work or personal responsibility. "Where is Marcus now?" I asked, noting his absence from this conversation that would fundamentally change his life. Vivian's smile widened. "At the lawyer's office, handling the paperwork to transfer the business accounts. We thought it best to move quickly with all the ongoing contracts and employee obligations. Carter Construction needs steady leadership during this transition." The calculated efficiency of it all became clear. While I'd been arranging Dad's funeral, coordinating with the Veterans Administration for his burial benefits, and dealing with my own grief, Vivian and Marcus had been systematically executing a plan to steal everything Dad had worked for. "I want to see the will," I said, extending my hand.
Vivian clutched the document closer to her chest. "I don't think that's wise, dear. It will only upset you more. The important thing is that Robert's final wishes are being honored." "His final wishes?" I repeated slowly. "Were that I would inherit the house and business? We discussed it extensively. He wanted Carter Construction to stay in the family, wanted me to use my leadership experience to grow it into something bigger." "That was before he got sick," Vivian replied with exaggerated patience, as if explaining something to a child. "Before he realized how much he needed family close by. Before Marcus proved himself to be the reliable son Robert never had." The insult was deliberate and precise. Dad had always been proud of my military service, had bragged to his construction crews about his daughter, the Green Beret, had kept every commendation and photo I'd sent him displayed prominently in his office. But Vivian was exploiting the one vulnerability I'd always carried, the fear that my absence, however necessary and honorable, had somehow failed him when he needed me most. I studied my stepmother's face, noting the micro-expressions that betrayed her true emotions beneath the performance of grief, the slight upturn at the corners of her mouth when she mentioned Marcus inheriting everything, the way her shoulders straightened with satisfaction when she saw my pain, the calculating coldness in her eyes that Dad had never been able to see or had chosen to ignore in his loneliness after Mom's death. "I'll be contesting this," I said quietly. Vivian's composure slipped for just a moment, revealing a flash of genuine concern before the mask slid back into place. "Of course you will. Robert said you'd probably react this way. Always had to fight everyone. Never could accept that other people might know what's best." She moved toward the front door, apparently confident that this conversation was over. "You have until the end of the week to collect your personal belongings. After that, Marcus and I will be moving in permanently to maintain the property properly." As she reached for the door handle, I spoke again. "Vivian?" She turned back, eyebrow raised in mild annoyance. "You have no idea what you've just started." Something in my tone must have penetrated her arrogance because her hand hesitated on the doorknob. For a moment, the confident predator was replaced by something more uncertain, as if she just realized she might have underestimated her opponent. Then the moment passed, and her smile returned. "Empty threats won't change anything, Alex. The will is legal and binding. Robert made his choice." After she left, I stood alone in the living room that would soon belong to strangers, surrounded by the memories of a childhood that apparently counted for nothing against Vivian's manipulation and Marcus's opportunism. The house felt hollow now, not just empty but violated, as if something essential had been torn from its foundation. But as I looked around at the furniture Dad had built, the photos documenting our family's history, and the flag that represented everything he'd taught me about duty and honor, I felt something else building alongside the grief and anger, something cold and tactical and infinitely patient. Vivian was right about one thing. My military service had taught me to fight, but she was catastrophically wrong about everything else. 12 years of special operations gave me skills she couldn't imagine, connections she didn't know existed, and a strategic mindset that turned her suburban scheming into amateur hour. Dad had raised me to believe in justice, in protecting what mattered, in never backing down when you knew you were right. And if Vivian thought a piece of paper and some crocodile tears would be enough to steal his legacy, she was about to learn exactly what kind of daughter Robert Carter had raised. The war for my father's legacy was just beginning.
3 weeks earlier, I'd been crouched behind a concrete barrier in Kandahar province, coordinating a night raid with my team when my satellite phone buzzed with an encrypted message from home. The text was brief, but devastating. Dad diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, stage 3. Surgery scheduled. Come home soon. Vivian. I'd stared at that message for 10 minutes, watching the words blur as my eyes filled with tears I couldn't afford to shed in front of my soldiers. Pancreatic cancer. The same disease that had taken my grandfather, Dad's hero, and the man who taught him everything about construction, honor, and building something that lasted. My commanding officer, Colonel Martinez, had found me an hour later, sitting in my quarters, still holding the phone. He'd taken one look at my face and sat down across from me without saying a word. That's when I learned that compassionate leave wasn't just bureaucratic paperwork. Sometimes it was a lifeline thrown to a soldier drowning in helplessness. "How long do you need, Carter?" he'd asked quietly. "I don't know, sir. Maybe forever." But forever wasn't an option. Not when my team was 3 weeks away from completing Operation Desert Shield, a mission we'd been planning for 8 months. Not when 6 other soldiers depended on my leadership to bring them home alive. And not when Dad himself had called me 2 days later, his voice weak but determined. "Alexandra Marie Carter," he said, using my full name the way he had when I was 8 years old and trying to skip school. "Don't you dare come running home because of some medical nonsense. You finish what you started over there. That's what Carters do." The conversation that followed had been one of the most difficult of my life. Dad, speaking between chemotherapy sessions, had laid out his plans with the same methodical precision he'd used to build Carter Construction, from a 2-man operation into the most respected commercial contractor in Millbrook. "The house is yours, kiddo," he'd said, his voice gaining strength as he talked about the future. "Every nail, every board, every memory in these walls. I built it for your mother, but she's gone, and now it's yours. The business, too, when you're ready to come home and run it properly." I'd tried to argue, tried to tell him I wasn't sure I wanted to leave the military, wasn't sure I was ready to be a civilian contractor instead of a soldier. But Dad had seen through my uncertainty to the deeper truth that I was scared of failing him, scared of not being good enough to fill the shoes of a man who'd built his reputation on integrity and excellence. "You've been leading soldiers through hell for 12 years. Managing a construction crew will be a vacation by comparison. Besides, you've got something I never had: formal training in logistics, project management, and leadership. You could take Carter Construction national if you wanted to." The pride in his voice had been unmistakable, tinged with excitement at the possibilities he saw for our family's future. We'd spent hours on subsequent calls, Dad sharing the details of every ongoing contract, every client relationship, every employee's strengths and weaknesses. He'd talked about expansion opportunities, about the reputation he'd built through 4 decades of honest work, about his dreams for what the company could become under younger, more educated leadership. "Promise me something, Alex," he'd said during our last conversation, just 5 days before he died. "Promise me you'll come home and build something bigger than what I ever imagined. Promise me the Carter name will mean something long after we're both gone." I'd promised. Standing in a forward operating base, 8,000 miles away, surrounded by the sounds of helicopters and diesel generators and the constant background tension of a war zone. That promise had carried me through the final weeks of deployment, through the endless paperwork of transitioning command to my replacement, through the 36 hours of flights and layovers that had brought me home just in time for the funeral. What I hadn't known, what Dad hadn't known, was that Vivian had been working on her own plans. Now sitting in my temporary hotel room 3 days after that devastating confrontation, I spread out everything I knew on the small desk. Dad's original will, dated 18 months ago, clearly stated his intentions. The house, the business, and the modest savings account would all pass to me upon his death. Vivian would receive a generous monthly allowance and could remain in the house as long as she chose, but ownership would transfer to me. But according to the document Vivian had waved in my face, Dad had signed a new will just 6 weeks ago, while I was unreachable in Afghanistan and he was weakened by chemotherapy. This new version gave everything to Marcus, with only a small cash inheritance for me, enough for a down payment on a modest apartment somewhere far from Millbrook. The timing was suspicious, the circumstances were suspicious, but most damning of all was the handwriting on the signature page, which looked shaky and uncertain. Nothing like the bold and confident script I'd seen on birthday cards and letters throughout my deployment.
I'd spent the last 3 days calling in favors from my military network, starting with Sofia Rodriguez, a former JAG officer who'd left the Army 2 years earlier to practice civilian law. Sofia had served 2 tours with me in Iraq and had saved my career when a corrupt contractor had tried to frame my unit for theft. If anyone could help me navigate this legal minefield, it was her. "Alex, I've been expecting your call," Sofia had said when she answered on the first ring. "I heard about your father through the Veteran Network. I'm so sorry for your loss." "Thanks, but I need your legal brain right now, not your sympathy," I'd replied, launching immediately into the details of Vivian's ambush. Sofia had listened without interruption, occasionally asking clarifying questions about dates, witnesses, and the exact language of both wills. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "This stinks," she said finally. "Everything about it stinks. 6 weeks ago puts the new will right in the middle of his chemo cycle, when cognitive function would have been compromised. And you said he never mentioned changing anything during your calls?" "Never. If anything, he was more specific about his plans than ever before. We talked about the transition timeline, about which employees I should trust, about clients who might try to take advantage during the ownership change. Why would he give me all that information if he was planning to leave everything to Marcus?" "He wouldn't," Sofia had agreed. "Question is, can we prove the new will is fraudulent without your father here to testify?" That's when I told her about the handwriting, about the timing, about Vivian's suspicious absence from the hospital during Dad's final days when, supposedly, she never left his bedside. Sofia had grown increasingly interested as I laid out the inconsistencies. "I'll need to see both documents," she'd said, "and we'll need to move fast. If they're already transferring business assets, we need to get an injunction to freeze everything until this can be properly investigated." "How long will that take?" "With the right evidence, maybe a week. Without it," Sofia had paused. "Alex, you need to understand that will contests are expensive, time-consuming, and emotionally brutal. Are you prepared for a long fight?" I'd looked around the sterile hotel room, thinking about the house I'd grown up in, the business Dad had spent his life building, the legacy he'd trusted me to protect. "Sofia, I've spent 12 years fighting for strangers' freedom in foreign countries. I think I can manage fighting for my own family's honor in my hometown." "That's what I was hoping you'd say. Give me 48 hours to review everything and prepare our initial filing. And Alex, start documenting everything. Every conversation with Vivian, every interaction with Marcus, every piece of evidence that supports your father's original intentions. We're going to need all of it." As I hung up the phone, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Dad's diagnosis. Hope. Not the desperate, grasping hope of someone trying to avoid inevitable loss, but the tactical confidence of a soldier who'd identified the enemy's weakness and was preparing to exploit it. Vivian thought she'd won by manipulating a dying man and forging his signature on a legal document, but she'd made one critical error in her calculations. She'd underestimated exactly what kind of daughter Robert Carter had raised. What Vivian didn't know, what nobody in Millbrook knew, was that Sergeant First Class Alexander Carter hadn't just spent 12 years as a regular soldier. I was Special Operations, specifically a Green Beret with the 5th Special Forces Group, trained in psychological operations, intelligence gathering, and what the military politely called unconventional warfare. More importantly, I wasn't just some grunt with a rifle. I held a master's degree in business administration from the University of Maryland, completed during my off-duty hours over 6 years of night classes and online coursework. While Vivian assumed I was just another jarhead coming home with PTSD and limited options, I'd actually spent the last decade developing skills that would translate perfectly to civilian strategic planning. But my greatest asset wasn't my education or training. It was the network I'd built across 3 combat deployments and countless joint operations with other military branches, federal agencies, and international allies. When you've saved someone's life in Fallujah or coordinated rescue operations in Syria, that person tends to remember you when you need a favor stateside. My first call after Sophia was to Tommy Chen, a former Navy SEAL who'd left the service 2 years ahead of me to start a private security consulting firm. Tommy and I had served together on a joint task force in Afghanistan, and he'd been the one to pull me out of a collapsed building after an IED explosion in 2019. More relevantly, his company specialized in corporate investigations and asset protection for high-net-worth clients. "Carter, I heard you were finally getting out," Tommy's voice boomed through my phone speaker with characteristic enthusiasm. "Please tell me you're not calling to ask for a job reference." "Better than that," I replied. "I need your particular skills for a family situation." The tone shifted immediately. Tommy had grown up in a military family. He understood that sometimes family situations required tactical solutions. After I explained the inheritance theft and Vivian's manipulations, he was quiet for a long moment. "So, you need background research on Stepmommy Dearest and her precious son, plus financial forensics on how they managed to forge a new will and start transferring assets so quickly." "That's just the beginning," I confirmed. "I need to understand their vulnerabilities, their pressure points, their secrets. Everyone has something they don't want exposed." "Everyone," Tommy agreed. "Give me 72 hours. I'll have preliminary reports on both subjects, including financial history, employment records, criminal background checks, and social media analysis. The full deep dive will take longer, but I can give you actionable intelligence by Friday." My second call was to Grace Mitchell, Dad's longtime neighbor, and the closest thing to a family friend we'd had since Mom died. Grace was 73 years old, sharp as a tack, and had been watching the Carter family dynamics with growing concern since Vivian's arrival 6 years ago. "Alexandra, honey, I was wondering when you'd call," Grace said before I could even identify myself. "That woman has been strutting around the neighborhood like she owns the place ever since the funeral. Makes me sick." "What exactly have you observed, Grace?" I asked, settling in for what I suspected would be a treasure trove of intelligence. "Where do I start? First off, she barely spent any time at the hospital during your father's final weeks. I know because I was there every day bringing him those sugar cookies he loved. Vivian would show up for an hour during visiting hours, make a big show of playing the devoted wife, then disappear until the next day. This contradicted everything Vivian had told me about her constant bedside vigil." "Where was she going?" "That's the interesting part," Grace continued, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "I followed her one day. Don't give me that tone, young lady. I'm old enough to be curious about whatever I want. She drove straight to some fancy lawyer's office downtown, stayed for 2 hours, then went shopping like she didn't have a care in the world." "Do you remember which law firm?" "Blackstone and Associates. I wrote it down because something felt wrong about the whole thing. Your father was dying and she's having lengthy meetings with lawyers? That didn't sit right with me." Grace had been uninventedly conducting surveillance on my stepmother, documenting behavior that would be crucial for establishing Vivian's real priorities during Dad's final weeks. But she had more information. "There's something else, honey. About a month ago, I saw Marcus coming out of your father's house late at night, carrying a box of papers. This was when Robert was barely conscious from the pain medication. Marcus looked nervous, kept checking over his shoulder like he was afraid someone would see him." "Did you see what was in the box?" "No, but I saw him loaded into his car and drive off towards downtown. Same direction as that lawyer's office. And here's the kicker. When I asked your father about it the next day, he had no memory of Marcus even visiting. Said he hadn't seen the boy in weeks." The picture was becoming clearer. While Dad was incapacitated by chemotherapy and pain medication, Vivian and Marcus had been systematically planning their theft of his estate. The late-night document removal, the secret meetings with lawyers, the convenient timing of the new will. It was a coordinated operation designed to exploit a dying man's vulnerability. "Grace, I need you to write down everything you remember," I said. "Dates, times, specific observations, and if you see any more suspicious activity, document it immediately." "You're going to fight this, aren't you?" she asked, hope evident in her voice. "I'm going to destroy this," I corrected, "but I need to do it the right way, with evidence and legal backing." My third call was to Detective Ray Phillips, a military police officer I'd worked with on a joint anti-terrorism task force in Germany. Ray had left the Army 5 years ago to join the Millbrook Police Department, rising quickly to detective due to his investigative skills and federal law enforcement experience. "Alex Carter," Ray said when he answered. "I heard you were back in town. Sorry about your father. He was a good man. Did some work on the police station renovation a few years back. Never tried to overcharge us like some contractors." "Thanks, Ray. Actually, I'm calling because I think someone's committed fraud against his estate." Ray's tone sharpened immediately. "Tell me more." I walked him through the timeline, the suspicious will, and the evidence Grace had provided. Ray listened carefully, occasionally asking questions about specific dates and locations. "Here's the thing," he said when I finished. "Will forgery is a felony, but it's hard to prove without the original testator alive to testify. However, if they forged his signature on other documents, bank transfers, business authorizations, property deeds, that's multiple counts of fraud and identity theft. How would we prove that? Financial forensics, bank security cameras, handwriting analysis, and if they were stupid enough to use electronic signatures or email communications." Ray paused. "Let me make some discreet inquiries. I can't open an official investigation yet, but I can check public records and see if there are any obvious irregularities in the asset transfers." As I hung up from that call, I realized that my 12 years of military service had given me something more valuable than Vivian could possibly understand: a network of highly skilled, fiercely loyal professionals who owed me favors and shared my commitment to justice. Sophia would handle the legal challenges. Tommy would uncover their secrets. Grace would provide ongoing surveillance. Ray would investigate potential criminal activity, and I would coordinate it all with the same strategic precision I'd used to plan missions in hostile territory. But I had one more asset that Vivian couldn't have anticipated: Dad himself. During our last conversation, he'd mentioned something that hadn't seemed important at the time, but now felt crucial. "Alex, I've been digitizing all the business records," he'd said. "Scanned copies of every contract, every employee file, every financial document going back 20 years. It's all stored in the cloud now, backed up to 3 different services. Modern times require modern record keeping." Those digital files would contain everything: the original will, business correspondence, financial records, and most importantly, examples of Dad's genuine signature on hundreds of documents. If Vivian and Marcus had forged his final will, the handwriting analysis would prove it conclusively. More than that, Dad's meticulous record-keeping would reveal the true financial status of Carter Construction, making it impossible for them to hide asset transfers or claim the business was worth less than its actual value. As I sat in my hotel room that evening, reviewing my growing intelligence network and strategic options, I felt the familiar calm that came before a mission. The enemy had revealed their position. I had superior intelligence gathering capabilities. My team was in place. Now it was time to show Vivian what happened when someone tried to steal from a Green Beret's family. By Friday morning, my intelligence network had delivered results that exceeded even my tactical expectations. Tommy's preliminary report arrived via encrypted email at 0600 hours, and what I read made my blood boil with righteous fury. Vivian's background check revealed a pattern of predatory behavior that stretched back 15 years. Born Vivian Blackwood in Miami, she'd been married 3 times before meeting my father. Her first husband, a retired police captain, had died in a suspicious car accident 6 months after changing his will to include her. The second, a small business owner, had suffered a fatal heart attack just weeks before their divorce was finalized. A divorce that would have left Vivian with minimal assets due to a prenuptial agreement. The third husband, James Morrison, had been a wealthy contractor in Tampa. According to court records Tommy had obtained, Morrison's adult children had contested his will after he died, claiming Vivian had isolated him from family and manipulated him during his battle with Alzheimer's disease. The case had been settled out of court, but not before Morrison's medical records showed he'd been receiving unauthorized medication that could have affected his cognitive function. "Alex, this woman is a professional predator," Tommy had written in his summary. "She targets older men with assets, isolates them from family, then manipulates them during periods of vulnerability. Your father fits the pattern perfectly. Recent widower, successful business, adult daughter deployed overseas. Marcus's background was equally revealing, though in a different way. Rather than a criminal mastermind, he appeared to be a weak-willed mama boy with a gambling addiction and a history of financial irresponsibility. Tommy had traced his credit history, employment records, and social media activity, painting a picture of someone completely dependent on his mother's schemes for survival. Subject shows significant debt accumulation from online gambling platforms, Tommy's report noted. Credit cards maxed out, multiple payday loans, eviction notice from previous apartment. Mother appears to be his only source of financial stability. Psychological profiles suggest he's following her lead rather than initiating fraud himself. This intelligence was strategically valuable. Marcus was the weak link in their operation, someone who might crack under pressure if confronted with evidence of his mother's criminal history. But the most damning information came from Ray's investigation into the financial transfers. Working through his police contacts and public records, he discovered that Vivian and Marcus had been systematically draining Dad's accounts for weeks before his death. "Alex, you need to see this," Ray had said when he called Thursday evening. "They didn't wait for the will to be probated. Starting 3 weeks ago, there have been significant transfers from your father's business accounts to accounts controlled by Vivian and Marcus. We're talking about nearly $200,000. How is that possible? Dad would never have authorized those transfers." That's where it gets interesting. The transfers were authorized through electronic banking, using login credentials that required knowledge of specific security questions. But here's the problem. The IP addresses for these transactions don't match your father's home computer. They're coming from a public library computer and a coffee shop near Blackstone and Associates. The evidence was building a clear picture of systematic theft. While Dad was incapacitated in the hospital, Vivian and Marcus had been using his banking information to drain his accounts, probably after obtaining his passwords through some form of coercion or deception. "There's more," Ray continued. "I checked the security footage from his bank for the dates of the largest transfers. Guess who shows up making cash withdrawals from your father's personal account? Marcus, using a debit card that should have been in your father's possession." "Can you arrest them?" "Not yet. I need more evidence to establish a clear case of fraud. But what I have is enough to freeze the accounts and stop any further transfers. I'll need Sophia to file the appropriate motions, but we can shut down their cash flow by Monday." While my team gathered external intelligence, I was conducting my own investigation into Dad's digital records. Using the cloud storage passwords he'd given me during our deployment conversations, I accessed 20 years of Carter construction files from my laptop. What I found confirmed everything I had suspected about Dad's true intentions and exposed the scope of Vivian's deception. Dad's real will, dated 18 months ago, was stored in multiple digital formats with timestamp verification. His signature on the original document was bold and confident, completely different from the shaky scrawl on Vivian's version. More importantly, the original will included detailed explanations of his reasoning, written in Dad's own words. Alexandra has demonstrated exceptional leadership capabilities during her military service. Her education, experience, and commitment to excellence make her the ideal person to carry Carter Construction into the future.
While I care for Vivian and appreciate her companionship during my final years, this business represents 4 decades of my life's work and should remain with my biological family. Even more revealing were the email exchanges between Dad and his original lawyer, dated just 3 months ago. In these communications, Dad had specifically expressed concern about Vivian's increasing pressure for him to modify his estate planning. "Mr. Carter," his lawyer had written, "I want to document your statement that you feel no pressure to change your will and that your current estate plan reflects your true wishes. You've indicated that your wife has suggested modifications, but you prefer to maintain the existing arrangement that prioritizes your daughter's inheritance." Dad's response was unequivocal. "That is correct. Alexandra will inherit the house and business. This decision is final and reflects my genuine desires for my legacy. These emails, sent while Dad was still mentally sharp and before the worst effects of chemotherapy, would be devastating evidence against Vivian's fraudulent will. But the most shocking discovery came when I found Dad's medical records in his personal files. As his designated emergency contact and holder of his medical power of attorney, I had legal access to his healthcare information. What I discovered made me physically sick. During the weeks when Vivian claimed to be his devoted caregiver, Dad's medication records showed unauthorized changes to his prescriptions. Someone had been requesting additional pain medication and anti-anxiety drugs that weren't part of his oncologist treatment plan. The prescriptions had been filled at 3 different pharmacies, suggesting an attempt to avoid detection. More damning, Dad's medical notes included observations from nurses about his confusion and disorientation during family visits, specifically noting that patient appears more lucid when alone than when family members are present. The picture was becoming horrifyingly clear. Vivian hadn't just isolated Dad from his support network. She'd been drugging him to maintain control over his decision-making during his final weeks. I sat in my hotel room Friday evening, surrounded by printouts and documents that painted a picture of systematic elder abuse, financial fraud, and criminal manipulation. The evidence was overwhelming, but it was also deeply personal. This wasn't just theft. It was a violation of everything Dad had stood for, everything he'd worked to build. My phone rang, interrupting my analysis. Sophia's number appeared on the screen. "Alex, I've reviewed everything you sent me," she said without preamble. "This isn't just a will contest anymore. What Vivian did to your father constitutes elder abuse, financial exploitation, and multiple felony fraud charges. We're not just fighting for your inheritance. We're building a criminal case." What's our next move? Emergency motion to freeze all assets, immediate investigation by Adult Protective Services, and coordination with the district attorney's office for criminal charges. But Alex, I need you to understand something. This is about to become very public, very ugly, and very personal. Are you prepared for that level of exposure? I thought about Dad's final words to me, his pride in my service, his dreams for Carter Construction's future. I thought about Vivian's smug satisfaction as she'd stolen everything he'd worked for. I thought about the vulnerability of other elderly victims who might fall prey to her schemes if she wasn't stopped. Sophia, I've spent 12 years fighting for justice in foreign countries. I think I can handle fighting for it in my hometown. That's what I was hoping you'd say. Monday morning, we go to war. As I hung up the phone, I realized that this had evolved beyond a simple inheritance dispute. This was about protecting vulnerable people from predators, about holding criminals accountable for their actions, and about ensuring that Dad's legacy would be honored rather than destroyed. Vivian had picked the wrong family to victimize. She was about to learn that some battles you simply cannot win. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Monday morning arrived with the precision of a military operation. Sophia had filed our emergency motions at 8 a.m. sharp, requesting immediate asset freezes, court-ordered investigations, and temporary restraining orders against further property transfers. By 9 a.m., Ray had coordinated with the district attorney's office to open a formal investigation into elder abuse and financial exploitation. By 10 a.m., Tommy's complete background report had been delivered to both the court and the prosecutor's office. But my most valuable ally turned out to be someone I hadn't expected, Dr. Sarah Blake, the oncologist who had treated Dad during his final months. I'd reach out to Dr. Blake on Saturday, using my medical power of attorney, to request a meeting about Dad's care during his final weeks. What I discovered during our conversation would prove to be the key to everything. Your father was one of my most mentally sharp patients, Dr. Blake had told me in her office at Riverside Memorial Hospital. Even during the worst phases of chemotherapy, his cognitive function remained excellent. That's why I was so surprised by the reports I received during his final 2 weeks. What kind of reports? Dr. Blake had pulled up Dad's electronic medical records, scrolling through notes from various healthcare providers. Multiple nurses documented confusion, disorientation, and unusual drowsiness during family visits. But when I examined him personally, he was always alert and coherent. The discrepancy was significant enough that I ordered additional neurological tests. What did those tests show? Normal brain function for someone his age with his diagnosis. No evidence of chemotherapy-induced cognitive impairment, no signs of dementia or delirium, which made the nursing observations very puzzling. Dr. Blake had paused, choosing her words carefully. I also noticed that his wife seemed unusually insistent on controlling his medication schedule and visitor access. In what way? She requested that all medications be given to her to administer at home, rather than having nurses handle them in the hospital. She also asked that we limit visiting hours and restrict access to immediate family only. When I explained that patients typically benefit from social interaction, she claimed that visitors were causing him stress and confusion. This painted a picture of systematic isolation designed to control Dad's environment and decision-making capacity. But Dr. Blake had more information that would prove crucial. "There's something else that troubled me," she continued. "During his final week, your father specifically asked me about his legal documents. He seemed concerned that his wife was pressuring him to sign papers he didn't understand. I offered to contact his lawyer or arrange for a patient advocate, but he said he'd handle it himself." "Did he sign any documents in the hospital?" "Not that I'm aware of. Hospital policy requires witnesses and documentation for any legal signings, and I have no record of such activities. But," Dr. Blake hesitated, "I should mention that his wife did bring outside visitors to his room several times during his final week. Older gentlemen in a suit, carried a briefcase. They always asked for privacy during these visits." The timeline was becoming crystal clear. While Dad was physically weakened but mentally sharp, Vivian had been bringing lawyers to his hospital room for private meetings. If they'd coerced him into signing documents during these sessions, it would explain the shaky handwriting and suspicious timing of the new will. Dr. Blake had agreed to provide sworn testimony about Dad's mental state and Vivian's unusual behavior, documentation that would be devastating to any claims that the new will represented his genuine wishes. But my alliance building wasn't limited to professional contacts. I'd also reached out to Dad's employees at Carter Construction, men and women who had worked for him for years and understood his true character and intentions. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours of my initial calls, word had spread throughout the construction community that the boss's daughter was fighting to protect his legacy. By Tuesday evening, I had offers of support from contractors, suppliers, clients, and employees who had witnessed Dad's pride in my military service and his plans for my eventual leadership of the company. "Mr. Carter talked about you constantly," said Frank Martinez, the foreman who'd worked for Dad for 15 years. "Showed us every picture you sent from overseas, read us parts of your letters when you described the construction projects you were managing for the Army. He was so excited about you coming home to modernize the business." "Did he ever mention changing his plans, leaving the business to Marcus instead?" Frank had laughed bitterly. "Marcus? That kid couldn't manage a lemonade stand, let alone a construction company. Mr. Carter used to joke that Marcus thought a hammer was something you used to open beer bottles. No way he'd leave the business to someone who'd never done a day of real work."
Similar conversations with other employees revealed a consistent pattern. Dad had been vocal about his succession plans, consistently identifying me as his chosen heir, and expressing frustration with Marcus's lack of work ethic or business acumen. More importantly, several employees had witnessed concerning changes in Dad's behavior during his final weeks at the office. "Mrs. Carter started showing up every day during his last month," reported Jenny Walsh, the office manager. "She'd sit in on his meetings, answer his phone calls, and insist on reviewing all his paperwork.
Mr. Carter seemed uncomfortable with it, but he was too sick to argue effectively. Did you notice any specific incidents? About 3 weeks before he died, Mrs. Carter brought Marcus in to learn the business, Jenny continued. But instead of observing operations, they spent hours in the file room, going through financial records and contracts. When I asked Mr. Carter about it later, he seemed confused about what they'd been doing and asked me to change the locks on the filing cabinets. These witness accounts would establish a pattern of unauthorized access to business records and systematic preparation for the asset theft that occurred after Dad's death. But perhaps my most unexpected ally was Marcus himself. On Wednesday evening, I received a phone call from a number I didn't recognize. When I answered, a nervous voice said, "Alex, this is Marcus. I think we need to talk." The conversation that followed revealed a young man who was clearly in over his head, manipulated by his mother into participating in schemes he didn't fully understand. "I didn't know about the other husbands," Marcus said quietly. "Mom told me they died in accidents, that she'd been unlucky in love. But this morning I found some documents in her room, court papers from Florida about the will contest. I looked up the case online and found news articles about the investigation." "What exactly did your mother tell you about the inheritance?" "That your dad had changed his mind during his final weeks, that he'd realized I was more like a son to him than you were. She said he wanted to take care of his real family instead of someone who'd abandon him for the military." Marcus paused. "But that never made sense. He never treated me like family. He was polite, but distant. I always felt like he tolerated me because of Mom." The guilt in Marcus's voice was obvious, suggesting that he might be willing to cooperate if offered the right incentives. "Marcus, are you aware that what you and your mother did constitutes multiple felonies? Bank fraud, identity theft, elder abuse, document forgery? We're talking about serious prison time." "I didn't forge anything," he protested. "Mom handled all the legal stuff. I just signed papers she told me to sign and made some bank withdrawals when she said your dad had authorized them." This admission was exactly what I needed. Marcus had just confessed to his role in the financial theft while implicating his mother as the mastermind. With the right legal strategy, he could become a cooperating witness against Vivian in exchange for reduced charges. "Marcus, I'm going to give you some advice that could save your life. Contact my lawyer immediately and arrange to cooperate with the investigation. Tell the truth about everything your mother did and your role in it. If you help us prosecute her, you might avoid prison. If you continue protecting her, you'll both go down together." After that call, I sat in my hotel room reviewing the alliance I'd built in just 1 week. Sophia would handle the legal strategy. Tommy would continue gathering intelligence. Ray would coordinate with law enforcement. Dr. Blake would testify about Dad's mental state. The construction crew would provide character witnesses. And now Marcus himself might become a cooperating witness against his own mother. Vivian had spent months carefully planning her theft of Dad's legacy. But she'd made one critical error in her calculations. She'd assumed I was just another soldier coming home with limited options and no support network. Instead, she'd triggered a response from someone with advanced training in strategic operations, backed by a network of professionals who shared my commitment to justice. The trap was set. Now, it was time to spring it.
Thursday morning brought the news I'd been waiting for. Sophia called at 0700 hours with barely contained excitement in her voice. "Alex, the judge granted our emergency motions across the board. All assets are frozen, effective immediately, including the house, the business accounts, and any property transfers initiated in the last 90 days. Vivian and Marcus can't touch another penny without court approval." What was their response? Complete shock, from what I understand. Vivian's lawyer, Henderson from Blackstone and Associates, scrambled to file counter motions claiming the freeze was premature and unnecessary. But the evidence Tommy provided about her previous marriages was enough to convince Judge Williams that there's probable cause for fraud investigation. The first phase of my counterattack had succeeded. Vivian's access to Dad's assets was now completely severed, and any attempt to liquidate or hide property would result in immediate contempt of court charges.
But the real victory came when Ray called an hour later with even better news. Alex, we executed search warrants this morning at Vivian's residence and Marcus's apartment. You're not gonna believe what we found. Tell me. Multiple draft versions of your father's will with different handwriting attempts on the signature lines. Practice pages where someone was clearly trying to forge his signature. And here's the kicker. A vial of prescription medication that wasn't prescribed to your father, but was being administered to him during his final weeks. The medication discovery was the smoking gun we needed. Ray explained that the drug was a powerful sedative that could cause confusion and memory impairment, especially when combined with the legitimate chemotherapy medications Dad was already taking. We also found detailed financial records showing exactly how they planned to liquidate his assets, house sale contracts with 3 different real estate agents, business valuation reports, and bank routing information for offshore accounts. This wasn't a spontaneous decision, it was a carefully planned operation. What about Marcus? Is he talking? Like a canary! Soon as we showed him the evidence from his mother's house, he broke down completely. Turns out she's been controlling his life for years, threatening to cut him off financially if he didn't cooperate with her schemes. He's agreed to full cooperation in exchange for immunity. Marcus's cooperation was strategically invaluable. As Vivian's co-conspirator, he had direct knowledge of her methods, timeline, and intentions. More importantly, his testimony would establish that the fraud was premeditated and systematic rather than opportunistic. The search warrants had also yielded intelligence about Vivian's broader operation. Hidden in her bedroom were documents related to her previous marriages, including detailed financial records of each husband's assets and copies of the contested wills that had made her wealthy. Alex, your stepmother isn't just a gold digger. She's a professional. We found what amounts to a handbook for elder exploitation, research on inheritance laws, information about cognitive impairment medications, and even psychological profiles of potential targets. This evidence would be crucial for establishing pattern behavior and demonstrating that Dad wasn't her first victim. But it also revealed something chilling about Vivian's level of sophistication and calculation. While law enforcement gathered evidence, I initiated the second phase of my operation, exposing Vivian's crimes to the community that had respected Dad's reputation and mourned his loss. Tommy's investigation had provided me with contact information for the adult children of Vivian's previous husbands, people who had suspected fraud but lacked the resources or evidence to pursue justice. I reached out to each of them, sharing what we discovered and offering to connect them with Sophia for potential civil lawsuits. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within 24 hours, I was coordinating with lawyers in 3 different states, representing families who wanted to reopen investigations into their father's deaths and the suspicious circumstances surrounding their estate transfers. Your evidence validates everything we suspected, said Patricia Morrison, the daughter of Vivian's 3rd husband. We knew something was wrong, but the police said there wasn't enough proof of foul play. Now that you've documented her methods, we can finally get justice for Dad. This network of Vivian's victims was becoming a powerful alliance. Their testimonies would establish her modus operandi and demonstrate that Dad's case wasn't isolated, but part of a systematic pattern of elder abuse spanning multiple decades. But the most satisfying development came when Grace called with intelligence from her ongoing neighborhood surveillance. Alexandra, you need to hear this, Grace said, her voice filled with righteous satisfaction. Vivian came home this afternoon after the police search, and she was on the phone screaming at someone for 20 minutes. I could hear her from my garden.
What was she saying? She kept yelling about how the plan was supposed to be foolproof, how someone had assured her that military daughters never had the resources to challenge estate transfers. She mentioned something about needing to disappear quickly and liquidate assets that weren't frozen. This intelligence suggested that Vivian was planning to flee rather than fight the charges, a tactical error that would make her appear guilty and eliminate any sympathy she might have garnered from the community. More importantly,
Grace had recorded the conversation on her smartphone, providing direct evidence of Vivian's consciousness of guilt and her coordination with unknown accomplices. "There's more," Grace continued. "She made several calls trying to book flights out of the country. I heard her mention the Cayman Islands and Switzerland. When the travel agent told her she needed a court order to travel due to the asset freeze, she started crying and hung up." Vivian's desperation was becoming evident, and desperate people make mistakes. Her attempts to flee would be reported to the court, likely resulting in her passport being confiscated and travel restrictions being imposed. That evening, Sophia called with an update on the legal proceedings. "Vivian's lawyer is pushing for a quick settlement," she reported. "Henderson offered to return the house and business in exchange for dropping the criminal charges. He's clearly trying to minimize his client's exposure before more evidence comes to light." "What did you tell him?" "That we're not interested in settlements. We want full prosecution for every crime she committed, complete restitution for all stolen assets, and justice for your father and her other victims. This isn't about money anymore, Alex. It's about stopping a predator." As I reviewed the day's developments, I realized that my strategy was working exactly as planned. The asset freeze had trapped Vivian financially, the criminal investigation had exposed her methods and gathered overwhelming evidence. Marcus's cooperation had eliminated her primary ally. The network of previous victims had established her pattern of behavior, and her own desperation was creating additional evidence of guilt. But I wasn't satisfied with simply winning the legal battle. Vivian had destroyed Dad's final weeks, poisoned his body with unauthorized medication, and stolen the legacy he'd spent 4 decades building. Legal consequences weren't enough. I wanted her to understand the full scope of what she had lost by targeting the wrong family. It was time to show her that some enemies fight back with everything they have. Friday morning would bring the next phase of my operation, the systematic destruction of every advantage she thought she possessed.
Friday arrived with the precision of an artillery barrage. While Vivian was still reeling from the asset freeze and criminal investigation, I launched a coordinated attack designed to dismantle every aspect of her carefully constructed life. The first salvo came from an unexpected direction: the media. Tommy's contacts in investigative journalism had been following our case with growing interest. When I authorized him to share Vivian's background with a trusted reporter from the Millbrook Herald, the resulting article hit the front page like a guided missile. "Local woman suspected in multi-state elder abuse scheme," read the headline, accompanied by Vivian's photo and detailed accounts of her previous marriages. The article outlined the suspicious deaths of 3 elderly husbands, the contested wills, and the pattern of financial exploitation that spanned 15 years. But the most damaging section focused on Dad's case specifically, describing him as a respected local businessman and military father whose final weeks had been destroyed by systematic abuse and manipulation. Robert Carter served his community for 4 decades as an honest contractor, the article stated. His daughter, Alexandra, sacrificed years of her life serving our country in Afghanistan. The alleged theft of his legacy represents not just a crime against one family, but an attack on the values of service and integrity that define our community. The public response was immediate and devastating for Vivian. Dad had been genuinely beloved in Millbrook, known for fair dealing, quality work, and generous support of local charities. The revelation that his final weeks had been spent being drugged and manipulated by his wife triggered outrage throughout the construction community and beyond. By noon, Vivian's phone was ringing constantly with calls from reporters requesting interviews. Her social media accounts were flooded with angry comments from Dad's friends and former clients. The country club, where she'd spent years cultivating her image as a grieving widow, revoked her membership after members complained about her presence. But the media attention was just the beginning. I'd coordinated with Sophia to ensure that criminal charges were filed the same day as the article's publication, creating maximum impact and eliminating any possibility that Vivian could control the narrative. Alexandra, the DA's office filed formal charges this morning, Sophia reported during our midday call. Elder abuse, financial exploitation, fraud, forgery, and conspiracy. Each charge carries significant prison time, and the prosecution is recommending no bail due to flight risk. What about Marcus? Immunity deal is finalized. He'll testify against his mother in exchange for probation and community service. His cooperation has been invaluable. He provided detailed timelines, recorded conversations, and copies of documents Vivian thought she'd destroyed. Marcus's decision to cooperate had been strategically crucial, but it also represented something deeper. In choosing to testify against his mother, he was finally breaking free from the cycle of manipulation and criminal behavior that had defined his entire adult life. The afternoon brought even better news when Ray called with updates from the criminal investigation. Alex, we've connected Vivian to a broader network of elder abuse criminals. The lawyer who helped her forge your father's will, Henderson from Blackstone and Associates, has been doing this for years. We found evidence of similar fraudulent documents for at least 6 other elderly clients. What does that mean for our case? It means Henderson is facing his own criminal charges and looking for a cooperation deal. He's already admitted to forging your father's signature and provided detailed testimony about Vivian's instructions. With his cooperation, we can prove every element of the fraud beyond any reasonable doubt. Henderson's cooperation eliminated Vivian's last potential ally and provided the prosecution with direct evidence of the forgery process. More importantly, it revealed that her criminal network was larger than we had initially suspected, involving corrupt lawyers, medical professionals, and financial advisors who specialized in exploiting vulnerable elderly clients. But my most personal victory came when I received a call from Carter Construction's largest client, a regional development company that had worked with Dad for over a decade. Ms. Carter, this is David Walsh from Walsh Development. I wanted to reach out personally after reading this morning's article. Your father was one of the most honorable men I've ever done business with, and what happened to him is unconscionable. Thank you, Mr. Walsh. Dad always spoke highly of your partnership. I want you to know that Walsh Development stands ready to support Carter Construction during this transition. We have 3 major projects starting next quarter, and we'd prefer to award those contracts to your company rather than competitors. Your father's reputation for quality and integrity should continue under your leadership.
This call was followed by similar commitments from other major clients who had seen the news coverage and wanted to demonstrate their support for Dad's legacy. Within hours, I had verbal commitments for over $2 million in new construction contracts, contingent on my assuming control of the company. The business community's response sent a clear message. They viewed me as Dad's legitimate heir, and Vivian as a criminal interloper who had no standing in their industry. But Vivian wasn't accepting defeat quietly. That evening, Grace called with intelligence about her increasingly desperate countermeasures. Alexander, she's been making calls all day, Grace reported. I heard her screaming at someone about hiring a private investigator to dig up dirt on you. She mentioned your military service specifically, saying there had to be something they could use against you. This intelligence revealed Vivian's tactical error. Rather than focusing on damage control or plea negotiations, she was wasting resources on attacking my reputation, an approach that would only generate more negative publicity and demonstrate her vindictive character to potential jurors. There's more, Grace continued. She tried to get Marcus to recant his cooperation agreement. I saw her at his apartment building this afternoon, and when he wouldn't let her in, she started screaming in the parking lot about family loyalty and threatening to disown him. Vivian's attempts to intimidate Marcus would be reported to the prosecution as potential witness tampering, adding yet another criminal charge to her growing list of legal problems. As Friday evening concluded, I reviewed the day's achievements with strategic satisfaction. The media coverage had destroyed Vivian's reputation and turned public opinion decisively against her. The criminal charges had eliminated any possibility of plea bargaining from a position of strength. Henderson's cooperation had provided ironclad evidence of the forgery. Marcus's testimony would detail her methods and timeline, and the business community's support had demonstrated that Dad's legacy would survive and thrive under my leadership. But perhaps most importantly, Vivian's own actions, her attempts to flee, her efforts to intimidate witnesses, her desperate attacks on my character were creating additional evidence of guilt and consciousness of wrongdoing. She was trapped in a cage of her own making, with every desperate move tightening the constraints around her. The predator who had spent years exploiting vulnerable elderly victims was finally facing an opponent who fought back with superior training, resources, and strategic thinking. The final phase of my operation would demonstrate that justice, when properly applied, could be more devastating than any revenge.
The confrontation I'd been preparing for finally arrived on Monday morning, orchestrated with the precision of a special operations mission. Sophia had arranged for a settlement conference in the conference room of the courthouse, ostensibly to discuss plea negotiations, but actually to provide Vivian with one final opportunity to confess her crimes and accept responsibility for what she'd done to Dad. I arrived 30 minutes early, dressed in my dress blue uniform with all my military decorations displayed. The choice was deliberate and psychological. I wanted Vivian to see exactly who she'd been fighting, to understand that she'd targeted not just any grieving daughter, but a decorated combat veteran with the training and resources to destroy her completely. When Vivian entered the conference room with her attorney, the change in her appearance was startling. The polished, predatory confidence had been replaced by something desperate and cornered. Her expensive clothing couldn't hide the weight loss from stress, the dark circles under her eyes from sleepless nights, or the tremor in her hands that suggested her carefully controlled facade was finally cracking. "Ms. Carter," Henderson began nervously, "my client is prepared to discuss a reasonable resolution to this matter." "There's nothing to discuss," Sophia replied coolly. "Your client committed multiple felonies against a dying man. She's facing 15 to 20 years in prison. The only question is whether she wants to plead guilty and accept responsibility or force the victims' families to endure a trial." For the first time since this began, I spoke directly to Vivian. "Look at me," I said quietly. She raised her eyes reluctantly, and I saw something I'd been waiting for. Fear. Real, genuine terror of someone who'd finally realized the scope of their miscalculation. "My father trusted you," I continued. "He welcomed you into his home, treated your son with kindness he didn't deserve, and provided you with security and comfort during his final years. In return, you poisoned him, forged his signature, stole his life's work, and tried to destroy everything he'd built for his family." Vivian's composure finally cracked completely. "You don't understand," she said, her voice breaking. "I needed the money. Marcus needed financial security. Your father was dying anyway, and you were never here. You abandoned him for the military while I took care of him every day." "You drugged him," I replied, placing copies of the medical evidence on the table. "You isolated him from people who cared about him. You brought lawyers to his hospital room when he was too weak to resist and coerced him into signing documents he didn't understand. That's not caregiving, that's torture." Henderson tried to regain control of the meeting. "Ms. Carter, perhaps we could discuss restitution and—" "No,"
I interrupted. Your client isn't just facing criminal charges for what she did to my father. We've connected her to similar crimes against 3 other elderly men. The FBI is investigating her for interstate fraud. The IRS is auditing her tax returns going back 10 years. And the families of her previous victims are filing civil lawsuits that will seize every asset she accumulated through her criminal enterprise. The blood drained from Vivian's face as she realized the full scope of what was coming. Her scheme to steal Dad's legacy had triggered investigations into her entire criminal history, exposing decades of elder abuse and financial exploitation. There's more, Sophia added. Henderson here has agreed to cooperate fully with federal authorities in exchange for reduced charges. He's provided detailed testimony about the document forgery process and identified other clients who were similarly victimized. Henderson's betrayal was the final blow to Vivian's defense strategy. Without her lawyer's support, she had no credible legal representation and no realistic hope of avoiding conviction. But I wasn't finished. Marcus has also provided a full statement. He described how you manipulated him into participating in your schemes, how you threatened to abandon him if he didn't cooperate, and how you've been controlling his life through financial dependency for years. He's testifying against you to break free from your manipulation. Vivian's face contorted with rage and desperation. He's my son! How could he betray his own mother? The same way you betrayed a dying man who trusted you, the same way you've betrayed every elderly person who made the mistake of caring about you. The room fell silent except for Vivian's ragged breathing. She looked around desperately, as if searching for some escape route that didn't exist. "What do you want?" she finally whispered. "Justice," I said simply. "Full confession to all charges, complete cooperation with the investigation into your previous crimes, restitution to every family you victimized, and a guilty plea that ensures you'll never have the opportunity to prey on vulnerable elderly people again." Henderson leaned over to whisper with her client, but Vivian pushed him away. "And if I agree to all that—"
Sophia consulted her notes. The prosecution might consider a sentence of 12 to 15 years instead of 20 to 25. With good behavior, you could be released when you're in your late 60s. Still young enough to find another husband to exploit, I observed, which is why there will also be permanent restraining orders preventing you from having any contact with elderly men outside of supervised family relationships. The calculation in Vivian's eyes was visible as she weighed her options. Fight the charges and face life in prison, or confess and accept a lengthy but survivable sentence. "I need time to consider," she said finally. "You have until tomorrow morning," Sophia replied. "After that, the plea offer expires, and we proceed to trial with the full extent of the charges." As we prepared to leave, Vivian made one final desperate attempt to regain some control. "You think you've won," she said, her voice filled with bitter hatred. "But you'll never get your father back. You'll never undo the fact that you weren't here when he needed you most. I was the one who held his hand when he was scared. I was the one who— You were the one who killed him. Maybe not with a gun or a knife, but with drugs and isolation and psychological torture. The man I spoke with during my deployment was sharp and hopeful about the future. The man you left in that hospital bed was confused and afraid because you'd been poisoning him for weeks." Vivian's face went white as she realized I knew the full extent of her abuse. Dad died thinking he was losing his mind. He spent his final days confused and disoriented because of the unauthorized medication you were giving him. That's not caregiving. That's murder by degrees. For the first time in our entire confrontation, Vivian had no response. The accusation hung in the air like a verdict, and everyone in the room understood that her manipulation and abuse had contributed directly to Dad's suffering during his final weeks. As we left the courthouse, Sophia put her hand on my shoulder. "How do you feel?" she asked. I considered the question carefully. The woman who had destroyed Dad's final weeks was facing justice.
The criminal network she'd operated was being dismantled. The legacy Dad had worked 40 years to build would be preserved and continue under my leadership. Like Dad can finally rest in peace, I replied.
Tuesday morning brought the conclusion I'd been working toward for weeks. Vivian's attorney called Sophia at 8 a.m. to announce that his client would accept the plea agreement rather than face trial. By 10 a.m., we were back in the courthouse for her formal confession and sentencing hearing. The courtroom was packed with people whose lives had been touched by Dad's generosity and integrity over the years. Construction workers he'd employed, clients whose projects he'd completed with excellence, neighbors who'd benefited from his community involvement, and veterans who'd served alongside him decades earlier. Their presence sent a powerful message about the man Vivian had victimized and the community that demanded justice for his memory. Judge Williams, a stern woman in her 60s who'd built her reputation on tough sentences for elder abuse cases, called the proceedings to order with obvious disgust for the crimes being addressed. "Mrs. Carter," she began, addressing Vivian directly, "you stand accused of some of the most heinous crimes our legal system recognizes, the systematic abuse and exploitation of vulnerable elderly victims. Before I accept your plea agreement, I want to hear you acknowledge exactly what you've done." Vivian stood slowly, her hands shaking as she read from a prepared statement. Her voice was barely audible as she confessed to forging Dad's will, administering unauthorized medications to control his behavior, stealing over $200,000 from his accounts, and manipulating him during his final weeks when he was too sick to resist. But the most damning part of her confession involved her previous victims. "I also acknowledge," she continued, her voice breaking, "that I engaged in similar schemes against James Morrison in Tampa, Florida, and Walter Hendricks in Phoenix, Arizona, resulting in their financial exploitation and contributing to their deaths through psychological manipulation and unauthorized medication." The admission sent shockwaves through the courtroom. While we'd suspected her involvement in previous deaths, hearing her confess to a pattern of behavior that had literally killed vulnerable elderly men was devastating, even for those of us who'd been building the case against her. Judge Williams' expression grew even more severe. "Mrs. Carter, your crimes represent a fundamental betrayal of trust that our society extends to caregivers and family members. You targeted men during their most vulnerable moments and exploited their need for companionship and care to steal their life's work and hasten their deaths." The judge then turned to Marcus, who'd been called to provide victim impact testimony about his own manipulation and abuse. "Your Honor," Marcus said, standing nervously in the witness box, "I want the court to understand that I'm not just a co-conspirator in these crimes, I'm also one of my mother's victims. She's controlled my life through financial manipulation since I was 18 years old, threatening to abandon me if I didn't participate in her schemes." Marcus's testimony was heartbreaking and revealing. He described years of psychological abuse, financial control, and manipulation that had left him without the skills or confidence to live independently. His cooperation with the prosecution represented not just justice for Dad, but his own liberation from a lifetime of maternal abuse. "I know I can't undo the harm I helped cause," he concluded, tears streaming down his face. "But I want Mr. Carter's family to know that he was always kind to me, even when I didn't deserve it. He tried to teach me about honest work and integrity, and I'm sorry I didn't listen until it was too late." When Judge Williams asked if I wanted to provide a victim impact statement, I stood and faced Vivian directly. "Your Honor, my father served his country in Vietnam, then spent 40 years building a business based on honesty, quality work, and treating people fairly. He raised me to believe in service, integrity, and protecting those who can't protect themselves." I paused, looking at the packed courtroom filled with people whose lives Dad had touched. Vivian Carter stole more than money and property. She stole my father's dignity during his final weeks. She stole his peace of mind by making him believe he was losing his mental faculties when he was actually being drugged. She stole his trust in the woman he'd married for companionship during his fight against cancer. My voice grew stronger as I continued. "Your crimes didn't just harm my father, they harmed every elderly person who now has reason to fear the people they trust most.
You've made it harder for legitimate caregivers to do their jobs and for elderly people to accept help when they need it. That might be your worst legacy of all." Judge Williams nodded approvingly before delivering Vivian's sentence.
Mrs. Carter, I hereby sentence you to 15 years in federal prison for elder abuse, financial exploitation, and conspiracy to commit fraud. You will also pay full restitution to all identified victims, forfeit all assets obtained through criminal activity, and upon release, you will be prohibited from serving as a caregiver, power of attorney, or beneficiary for any elderly person outside of immediate family members under court supervision. The sentence was everything we'd hoped for. Lengthy enough to ensure Vivian couldn't harm anyone else for over a decade, comprehensive enough to strip away all her ill-gotten gains, and restrictive enough to prevent future crimes even after her release. As Vivian was led away in handcuffs, I felt a complex mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Justice had been served, but it couldn't bring Dad back or restore the peaceful final weeks he deserved after a lifetime of service and generosity. Outside the courthouse, Sophia and I were approached by representatives from the other victim families, people whose fathers and husbands had suffered similar fates at Vivian's hands. "Ms. Carter," said Patricia Morrison, whose father had been Vivian's third victim, "thank you for having the courage and resources to fight back. Our families tried to seek justice, but we didn't have the evidence or legal support to make it happen. Your father's case finally gave us the opportunity to hold her accountable for all her crimes." The collaboration between victim families had been crucial for establishing Vivian's pattern of behavior and ensuring she faced consequences for all her crimes, not just the ones against Dad. As the crowd dispersed, I received a call that brought the day full circle. "Ms. Carter, this is David Walsh from Walsh Development," the familiar voice said. "I wanted to be the first to congratulate you on today's outcome. When can we schedule a meeting to discuss those construction contracts we mentioned? Carter Construction has a bright future ahead of it." Standing on the courthouse steps where justice had finally been delivered, I looked toward the future Dad had envisioned. A family business built on integrity, a legacy of service and excellence, and the knowledge that predators who target vulnerable people will eventually face consequences for their crimes. The war for Dad's legacy was over, and we had won decisively.
6 months later, I stood in the main office of Carter Construction, surrounded by blueprints and project proposals that represented the company's brightest future in decades. The business Dad had spent 40 years building was not just surviving, it was thriving under the leadership he'd always envisioned for it. The transition from military service to civilian contractor had been smoother than I'd expected, thanks partly to the skills I'd developed during deployment and partly to the incredible team of employees Dad had assembled over the years. Frank Martinez, the foreman who'd worked for Dad since I was in high school, had become my operations manager. Jenny Walsh had expanded her role from office manager to administrative director. Together, we'd modernized the company's systems while maintaining the standards of quality and integrity that had built Dad's reputation. "Alex, the Morrison Medical Center project is ahead of schedule and under budget," Frank reported during our weekly staff meeting. "The client is so impressed they're already talking about the next phase of construction." The Morrison Medical Center was particularly meaningful to me, a state-of-the-art facility designed specifically for elderly care, with features that prioritize dignity, independence, and family involvement. In many ways, it represented everything Dad would have wanted his legacy to support, helping vulnerable people rather than exploiting them. "How's the staffing situation for the Richmond office expansion?" I asked Jenny. "We've got applications from 12 qualified candidates, including 3 veterans who heard about our military-friendly hiring policies. I think your father would be proud of how many service members were able to help transition to civilian careers." Dad would indeed have been proud.
Carter Construction had become a model for veteran employment in the construction industry, offering apprenticeship programs, mental health support, and leadership development opportunities specifically designed for former military personnel. But the most unexpected development in our company's growth had come from an unlikely source: Marcus. After Vivian's sentencing, Marcus had struggled with the transition to independent living. Without his mother's financial support and manipulation, he'd been forced to confront his gambling addiction and develop actual life skills for the first time in his adult life. The process had been difficult, but it had also revealed someone very different from the weak, dependent person I'd initially encountered. Alex, I know this might sound crazy, but I've been thinking about what your father tried to teach me about honest work. I'm 6 months clean from gambling, I'm living in my own apartment, and I'm attending community college to learn construction management. The conversation that followed had been one of the most surprising of my life. Marcus had genuinely absorbed Dad's lessons about integrity and hard work, but he'd been unable to apply them while under his mother's control. Freedom from her manipulation had allowed him to discover his own potential for growth and contribution. "I don't expect you to forgive me," he'd continued. "I know I participated in terrible crimes against someone who tried to help me, but I want to honor his memory by becoming the kind of person he believed I could be." After extensive discussion with Sophia, Grace, and my core team at Carter Construction, I'd made a decision that surprised everyone, including myself. I offered Marcus an entry-level position with our company, contingent on his continued sobriety, ongoing therapy, and completion of his construction management degree. "Are you sure about this?" Sophia had asked when I told her about the offer. "He's technically family now, but he's also someone who helped steal your inheritance. He's also someone who chose to cooperate with the prosecution when it mattered. And Dad always believed in second chances for people willing to do the work to change." 6 months later, Marcus had become one of our most dedicated employees. His personal experience with manipulation and addiction had given him unique insights into helping other struggling workers, and his genuine remorse for his past actions had motivated him to work harder than anyone else on the team. "Marcus completed his first independent project supervision this week," Frank reported during our meeting. "Small residential renovation, but he handled it professionally, and the client was satisfied with the quality." Watching Marcus develop into a competent, honest construction worker felt like completing something Dad had started: the transformation of a lost young man into someone capable of contributing meaningfully to his community. But perhaps the most meaningful restoration had been my relationship with the house on Pine Ridge Avenue. After the legal proceedings concluded and the property was officially returned to my ownership, I'd faced a difficult decision about whether to live in a place filled with so many painful recent memories. Vivian's presence had contaminated spaces that had once felt safe and welcoming, and I'd initially considered selling the property and starting fresh somewhere else.
Grace had been the one to convince me otherwise. "Alexandra, your parents built that house with love," she'd said during one of our weekly coffee conversations. "They raised you there, celebrated holidays there, and dreamed about your future there. One terrible woman's crimes can't erase 30 years of happy memories." Grace had been right. With Vivian's belongings removed and the house restored to its original character, the painful associations had gradually faded. More importantly, living there had allowed me to feel Dad's presence in ways that brought comfort rather than grief. I'd converted his workshop into a home office where I could review construction plans and manage Carter Construction's expanding operations. His tools remained on their original pegboards, and I'd added my own military memorabilia to create a space that honored both our forms of service. The most touching discovery had come when I'd cleaned out his desk and found a folder labeled "For Alex when she comes home." Inside were copies of every letter I'd sent from deployment, printed emails we'd exchanged, and photographs he'd taken of Carter Construction projects, with notes about techniques he wanted to teach me. The final item in the folder had been a handwritten letter dated just 2 weeks before his cancer diagnosis. "Alexandra, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone and you've come home to take over the business like we planned. I want you to know that
every day of your military service made me proud, not just because you were serving our country, but because you were developing into the kind of leader Carter Construction needs for the future. Don't let anyone tell you that your time away was wasted or that you abandoned family responsibilities. You were becoming the person I always knew you could be. Now use everything you've learned to build something bigger and better than what I ever imagined. The company is yours, the house is yours, and most importantly, the responsibility to help others and serve your community is yours. I trust you completely to honor our family's legacy while creating your own. Love, always, Dad. P.S. If that gold-digging woman I married tries to cause problems, remember that you're a Green Beret. She's just a suburban con artist. You have this handled. Reading Dad's final message had brought tears to my eyes, but also a sense of completion. Even facing terminal illness, he'd maintained his faith in my abilities and his sense of humor about the challenges I might face. As I sat in my office that evening, reviewing proposals for 3 major construction projects that would employ over 50 people and contribute millions to the local economy, I felt Dad's presence more strongly than I had since his death. The phone rang, interrupting my reflection. Carter Construction, this is Alex. Miss Carter, this is Colonel Martinez, your former commanding officer. I hope you don't mind me calling, but I wanted to check on how your transition to civilian life was progressing. Very well, sir. Better than I expected, actually. Outstanding. I'm calling because we've got several Special Forces veterans who are separating from the service in the next few months. They're looking for opportunities to use their leadership skills in civilian careers. I thought Carter Construction might be a good fit. As I discussed employment opportunities for transitioning veterans with my former commander, I realized that Dad's legacy had evolved beyond anything he could have imagined. Carter Construction wasn't just a successful business, it had become a vehicle for helping other veterans find purpose and community after their military service ended. Looking around the office Dad had built, filled with evidence of the company's growth and positive impact on our community, I understood that justice meant more than punishing Vivian for her crimes. It had meant preserving and expanding something good, something that made the world better rather than just settling scores. Vivian had tried to steal Dad's legacy, but she fundamentally misunderstood what that legacy actually was. It wasn't money or property or social status. It was the values of service, integrity, and helping others that he'd passed on to me and that I was now sharing with employees, clients, and fellow veterans. As I locked up the office and drove home to the house where Dad had raised me to believe in justice and service, I smiled thinking about what he'd say if he could see Carter Construction now. Not bad for a Green Beret with no construction experience, but wait till you see what you accomplish next year. The future he'd envisioned was just beginning.